Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm Dr. Matthew Levitt, the director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence and the former Wexler Fellow here at the Washington Institute. And I'm thrilled to have with me today Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, John Cohen, from the Department of Homeland Security. Today, we're going to be talking about the department's role in countering violent extremism, and in particular, its role in the context of the newly rolled out domestic terrorism prevention plan rolled out by the White House last week, and what that means structurally and otherwise for the department. John, you'll have the opportunity to give some opening remarks, and then we'll go straight into Q&A. Those of you who are participating via the webinar are welcome to ask your questions through the Q&A function, which if you move your mouse, you should find in the center bottom of your screen. Those of you who are participating via the live stream on our website can also ask questions by emailing your questions to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum, one word, @washingtoninstitute, one word, .org. John, it's a pleasure to have you back at the Washington Institute. We have had you on this platform for this series before, and your last time around at DHS. It's a pleasure to have you back today. Thank you in advance. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Matthew. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be back with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And you're right. I mean, last time I joined you was back in March in 2014. The event focused on 1 year after the Boston Marathon bombings. What have we learned about the terrorist threat facing the US? And as I actually went back and watched that session, it was striking to me how much we have learned since then about the dynamics of the threat. At that time, I introduced the concept of countering violent extremism, and our approach, which focused mostly on the threat posed by individuals who were motivated by terrorist ideologies to commit acts of violence. But as I look back and as I think about where we were then and where we are now, I have to say, in all honesty, that I think to some degree, some of the assumptions that we relied upon to develop that strategy of countering violent extremism were flawed. And I think at the time that I delivered those remarks in March of 2014, we underappreciated the amount of distrust that existed, particularly amongst some communities, the Arab American and Muslim communities in particular, and government and law enforcement in particular. So as I sit here today, and what I'm going to talk about today is the result of almost 7 years of research, analysis by law enforcement, mental health professionals, government and non-government entities, academic institutions. I think as we sit here today, we have a much better understanding of the dynamics of the threat, which I believe is probably more complex, more dynamic, and to some degree more dangerous than the threat we faced even after the September 11th attacks. So I'll get into all that in just a moment, but it's good to be back with you. I'm sitting here also following the release just last week of the Biden-Harris administration national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And as that strategy points out, and as you well know, that the concept of domestic terrorism is not a new threat facing the United States. We've had many events throughout our history where individuals inspired by or motivated by domestic extremist ideological beliefs have engaged in destructive behavior, acts of violence, acts of mass violence. But I have to say that the trend lines of the current threat, which is, as I mentioned earlier, complex, really began to emerge as far back as 2012. It was beginning to creep to the surface in 2014 when we last spoke. And I think this strategy takes into account the dynamics of this threat. And it's a comprehensive strategy that provides a framework And it's built on 4 pillars: understanding and sharing domestic terrorism related information, preventing domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization to violence, disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism activity, and confronting long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. And DHS was a major part of the deliberations that took place within the White House regarding the strategy. And we have a key role working with others in the federal government, as well as state, local, tribal authorities, private sector, non-government entities to implement it. So I'm not going to go through a lot of the details of the strategy. What I do want to take some time, though, is to discuss the underlying understandings informing our thinking at the department, because I think that will provide some context into the operational and programmatic activities we are prioritizing. So first, let's talk about the threat. Those of us who have worked counterterrorism for long periods of time, understood it to be a very organizational threat, meaning you have terrorist organizations, they recruit, they train operatives, they deploy operatives to conduct attacks on behalf of the organization. And much of what we designed from a counterterrorism perspective focused on intercepting communications between operatives that belong to an organization, detecting travel by operatives, acquiring intelligence about plots by identifying and intercepting communications through organizational leaders, disrupting the ability of an organization to operate by targeting its leadership structure. And while there are organizational elements to the DT threat that we're facing today, it really is a much more individualized threat. As repeatedly assessed by DHS and the FBI, the most significant terrorism-related threat facing the US today comes primarily from lone offenders who engage in violent activity inspired by extremist beliefs and/or personal grievances, or a blend of both. And in many instances, the cultivation of this belief system or personal grievance that serves as the impetus for an attack comes through the consumption of online content. As we look at the ideologies that are inspiring the most lethal attacks in the United States over the past several years, they primarily come from individuals who are inspired by racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist beliefs. And to pull the thread on that even more specifically, when we're talking about lethal attacks, it's typically people who hold extremist ideological beliefs focusing on the superiority of the white race, or are anti-government in their orientation. The challenge here is that while the specific motives behind the attacks may vary, and oftentimes the ideological motive is a blend of ideologies, or a blend of ideological beliefs and personal grievances. And while the motives may vary from attack to attack, analysis tells us that many of the attackers share common behavioral characteristics. In particular, they are angry, they feel socially disconnected, they're seeking a sense of life meaning. They spend, as I mentioned before, a significant amount of time online consuming violent or extremist-related online content. And they ultimately self-connect with a cause, a series of causes, or a grievance to justify the use of violence as a way to express their anger. There was an assistant director of the FBI who a couple of years back summed it up by saying, the primary driver of this threat is that there's a growing number of people in the United States who are angry and are searching for the justification to use violence as a way to express that anger. And through those types of conversations, we've begun to focus on a phrase, which is, when we try to explain the threat, is it's not the ideology and it's the psychology. And what that means is that if we're going to be effective in countering the threat posed by today, we have to understand that in many respects, it's the behavioral characteristic of these individuals versus what race they belong to, what ethnicity they have, what religion they practice, what their socioeconomic status is. That's all less important today than the underlying behavioral health, behavioral or community environment that the person is living in. This is also a threat that does not fit neatly into traditional terrorism or extremist definitional categories. And look, you spend time as an analyst at the FBI, and you've worked closely with the intelligence community. I've spent 34 plus years in law enforcement and national security. We love to define things clearly. right? This is a terrorist organization. This is a Sunni or Shia terrorist or terrorist group. This is a domestic extremist ideological belief system. The problem is that this specific threat does not fit necessarily into neat definitional categories. And in many respects, those who engage in, or in many instances, those who engage in violence often self-connect with a combination of extremist beliefs or a blend of extremist beliefs and personal grievances. So we've heard new expressions, new terms of art, such as salad bar extremism, which refers to the fact that an individual may be exposed or may consume content regarding a broad range of ideological extremist beliefs, and they'll pick and choose elements out of each one till they come up with their own sort of personalized ideological belief system that provides them the justification to engage in violence. We've also heard the term hybrid ideologies, which refers to the concept that an individual may blend white supremacy with incel, with anti-government beliefs, maybe with a little anarchism blended in there just to top everything off. And from an investigative perspective, that's what makes things very complicated, because it makes it very difficult to discern what is precisely the motive behind an individual traveling down the path toward violence. This is a threat that has manifested itself both in the physical and digital environments. Online content, disinformation, false narratives, conspiracy theories spread by a broad range of foreign and domestic threat actors. In some cases, nation states, international terrorist groups, domestic extremist thought leaders. It is that content and those narratives that very often fuel the violence we are experiencing. One of the things that's really interesting to me, having started my career working in foreign counterintelligence, targeting the KGB and the GRU of the Soviet Union, is that we are seeing foreign nation state threat actors understand that there are fractures in our society, and they are purposely seeking to exploit those fractures or the anger and discord of our public discourse, of our political discourse, for the very purposes of sowing discord and inciting violence, and in some cases inciting extremist violence. Individuals preparing to conduct attacks will often discuss their plans online, both on private and in public online forums and communities. One of the phrases that we've heard recently when talking to folks from the academic community who are conducting research on online activity in the tech sector is that violent extremists will typically plan in private and play in public, meaning they'll develop their narratives or they'll develop their operational plans in private, but then private forums, and then purposely move those conversations into public forums so that they can spread the narrative as broadly as possible in the hopes that they will influence the behavior of individuals in our society who are vulnerable and susceptible to being influenced by this online content and engage in violent or destructive behavior. And it's also, I'm mindful of the fact that we're dealing with this threat, this increasing level of violence by individuals inspired by extremist ideology and personal grievances at the very same time that we're dealing with an evolving threat posed by foreign terrorist groups, events in the Middle East that have incited harassment, destructive behavior, and targeted acts of violence directed at members of the Jewish and Muslim communities here in the United States. We're seeing the continuation of a multi-year increase in violent crime in cities across the country, which includes mass shootings or mass casualty attacks by individuals who are a member of street gangs or involved in domestic violence situations or workplace situations, and a rise in crime that's being fueled in large part by a sustained flow of cocaine, methamphetamine, synthetic opiates from the South, and the concern that those violent crime conditions may be exacerbated as we come out of COVID-19 restrictions. We are dealing with disinformation campaigns by foreign adversaries intended to undermine confidence in the government broadly, our response to COVID specifically, and destabilize our political system. And we have an increase in cyber instances, ransomware attacks, denial of service, and other types of cyber attacks targeting our government, critical infrastructure, academic institutions, and nation states. So I go through all of this in some detail because understanding all of this provides context to the types of activities we're focusing on at the department in order to address this threat. And bearing in mind the time, and I want to save a lot of time for questions, I'll just say that we have focused our activities into several areas. One, improving our understanding of the threat and sharing information about the threat with our state and local partners, the private sector, those who may reside within communities. We are working to expand our capability with the JTTFs, but we're also mindful of the fact that joint terrorism task forces may not be enough, that there are individuals who may pose a high risk of violence who do not meet the threshold of a JTTF investigation. And so we have focused more resources on working with local communities to build upon and enhance community-based prevention programs, where local communities can work together to focus on threat assessment, investigation, threat management strategies, so that high-risk individuals who may not meet the threshold of a domestic terror investigation are addressed from a risk perspective, and the risk posed by those individuals mitigated. We have expanded our efforts to understand emerging narratives online and evaluate which narratives pose the greatest risk of inciting violence, and in doing, and before doing so, spreading across multiple platforms. We want to use that understanding of these narratives to inform risk mitigation activities that take place in the physical world. We're examining the watch listing process. Again, I'm pretty comfortable that the FBI and the TS and the Terror Screening Center have a valid and defendable threshold that prevents individuals from being placed into the terror screening database simply because of their political beliefs. But we also have to understand that there are high-risk individuals who do not meet that threshold, that continue to travel, pose a risk to aviation and transportation infrastructure. It may travel as part of an effort to engage in violent or destructive behavior. And so the question we're asking is there more we can do to apply greater screening or scrutiny to those individuals when they enter into the transportation infrastructure? I'll close by just saying one thing. I think it's really important that I stress this. Our objective in addressing domestic terrorism and the issue of domestic violent extremism is not to police thought. That's not our job in law enforcement. That's not our job at the Department of Homeland Security. In this country, you have a constitutionally protected right to develop your thoughts and express those thoughts. And you can even adopt ideologies that are prejudicial and may incite anger in others with whom you share those beliefs with. But that's not our job at the department to police those thoughts. It is our job to prevent violence. And regardless of the ideological belief system that inspires that violence, our job is to work with state and local governments, others at the federal level, communities across the country to prevent violence. So as we develop our plans and develop these programs, my closest partners right now at the department are our Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office and the Privacy Office. And every operational plan that we developed, we're developing with them at the table. So with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Matt, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much for those comments. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask you a few questions, and we'll go straight to the questions from our participants. I have several that have come in already on the chat and via email. So I want to remind everybody, if you're on the webinar, you can ask questions through the Q&A function, which you should find in the bottom middle of your screen. If you're participating via the live stream, you can still send us questions by emailing them to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So John, let's start where you left off, that the department does not police thought, it prevents violence. You also mentioned that a significant amount of the radicalization that is happening online and because of disinformation. And so I imagine that there is a desire, even if it's not to police the thought, to be aware and on top of the dangerous ideas that are floating around out there, to be able to track people's process of radicalization, so that if and when someone does get to the point of potential violence, you're able to act. But I imagine that there are privacy and other concerns related to that, and that there are probably limitations, in particular on your ability to collect that information, even in the open source. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question you asked. So if we would have had this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, I would have placed into the discourse the concept that, I would ask the question, is there more that could be done to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to evaluate individuals' online behavior to detect those who warrant further investigation because they represent a threat of violence? And over time, I've just come to believe that that is a close to impossible task because of the amount of information that's online, the amount of activity, the amount of people that engage in online discourse, and quite frankly, the constitutional and privacy requirements of doing something that would be very difficult to even develop. But what I have also learned, though, and I've learned a lot of this from institutions, academic institutions and research institutions and research that's going on in the tech sector is there are ways to evaluate themes, narrative themes that are emerging in both private and public online communities. And without focusing on the specific identity or the specific individual, but by looking at what themes are beginning to resonate with large numbers of people, what themes are more likely to incite violence, what themes are likely to spread across multiple platforms and be spread more broadly into the online ecosystem, that information could be valuable in helping to evaluate what are the potential threats, what are the potential targets that would be impacted should a narrative incite violence behavior by an individual or groups of individuals. So the idea here isn't to track or to use research institutions or non-government entities to track individual behavior online. It's to evaluate the totality of behavior that may be occurring in threat-related platforms or online communities, and evaluate what are the themes that are resonating, what are the themes that are spreading, what are the themes that are likely to incite violence. So an example would be, I am concerned that if there is a disinformation narrative suggesting that 5G infrastructure is dangerous to the health of individuals and people should vandalize 5G infrastructure, that yes, that's important to me and that's something we should know. But vandalizing a cell tower isn't necessarily going to cause people to die. And in my current role, I'm very concerned about those narratives, such as the narratives relating to the Great Replacement theory, which inspired attacks in two synagogues in the United States and in El Paso Walmart. I'm concerned about looking at narratives such as that, which tend to generate active discourse online and then spread broadly. Those are the types of narratives that we know may influence violence. So again, it's looking at themes, it's evaluating which themes are more likely to incite violence. It's understanding how those themes are being introduced into the ecosystem. In particular, are they being introduced by threat actors that we know are trying to incite violence? And that it's understanding how those themes are spreading so that we can then assess whether there are things we can do in the physical world to reduce the risk. And real quickly, an example. After the January 6th incident at the Capitol, what we saw being reflected online in online communities was a call for additional violence. They were calls that were spreading across multiple platforms and being amplified by a significant number of individuals. And they were calling for violence on Inauguration Day, and they were calling for violence in state capitals on Inauguration Day. And our response was, okay, these are the themes, these are the narratives, this is how they're being responded to, this is how they're being amplified, this is how they're spreading. The planners then created a more enhanced military and police presence in DC. You saw physical barriers around certain sites. You saw an enhanced police presence in state capitals. What we saw reflected in response in the social media community was recognition that these security measures were in place, a reluctance to engage in violence while those security measures were in place, furthermore, a reflection that perhaps they should wait for times that were more opportunistic in order to engage in violence. So what that tells me is that we can understand the themes, we can derive information about the specific threat, and then we can take actions in the physical world that reduce the risk posed by that threat.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned over the course of your introductory remarks a bunch of terms that get to the issue of the ideological fluidity, the salad bar, the hybrid ideologies, volatile mix of grievances. When the Biden-Harris administration asked for the domestic terrorism policy review that ultimately led, among other things, to the new strategy, it also asked for an intelligence assessment, which I know that the department played a large role in, along with other parts of the intelligence community. And from the declassified portion of that, we know that there are several buckets of ways in which the US government looks at the issue of domestic violence extremism, to include kind of domestic terrorism, militia violent extremism, agave, anti-government and anti-authority violence, animal rights, abortion, and then this other category to include kind of incels, QAnon, etc. Can you speak a little bit to how and where some of the disinformation and conspiracy, QAnon, for example, fits in as it overlaps with these other ideologies? And is it just a lot less important, perhaps, how that manifests itself if the way that law enforcement is beginning to engage in this problem is not through the lens primarily of ideology, but, as you put it, of psychology, and not only of counterterrorism and law enforcement, but of community-based prevention programs?
Yeah, so a good example of what you just described is what I would call the Boogaloo concept, right? So we all remember, or those of us that are older, remember the movie Electric Boogaloo. We remember that the term Boogaloo in the earlier days of the internet, and I mean not even 3 or 4 years ago, was sort of a joke term to refer to somebody who was saying something crazy. Oh, that's Boogaloo. But today it has evolved as a thematic umbrella focusing on the need for a second civil war. And it's a thematic umbrella that actually has been cited by individuals who have engaged in homicide and targeted acts of violence directed at law enforcement and others in government. But when you pull the thread on, who's in the Boogaloo movement, I mean, because I would offer that Boogaloo is not an organization; it's a belief system, but it involves people who come from a broad range of previously held ideological beliefs. You have some folks who gravitate towards this belief based on white supremacist beliefs. Others, it's more purist anti-government. The current government's illegal, it needs to be replaced. You have people from the farther left end of the ideological spectrum, anarchists and others, but they've all been sort of pulled together primarily by algorithms that were used by social media companies to keep people online by directing them into content and communities that resonated with them. And you have people who, in the name of Boogaloo, will engage in violence, but their underlying ideological beliefs may differ. And that's why in some cases, Boogaloo is not just a civil war replacing the government, but it's a civil war that's more racially oriented, right? Reestablishing preventing a replacement of the white race, establishing a government that's based on Western values. In other cases, it's more attuned to the anarchist elements. But the point is that the violence is being inspired by people who cite this belief system of Boogaloo, but when you try to pull the thread on their underlying ideological beliefs, they may differ from person to person. And that's sort of what we're seeing now. I mean, you have individuals who may target a specific location because of the race of individuals or the profession of individuals who work in that location. They may be loosely affiliated with ideological beliefs, but at the end of the day, the question of whether it's the personal grievance or the ideological belief that is actually the primary impetus for the violent act is what is complicated for investigators. I mean, one good example of that is, and I think it really highlights the challenge that we're facing right now, is the case of the Indianapolis shooter, where you had an individual whose mother called local police because she believed her son was in the midst of a mental health crisis, that he was suicidal. They responded using a crisis intervention approach. which was dealing with the immediate situation. While on scene, they noted what looked to be like extremist content, white supremacist content on his computer. There was a reference to the JTTF. They did a preliminary investigation. They found they could not establish a pure ideological belief system. And then months later, the individual who, once he passed through the immediate crisis intervention from the mental health perspective, acquired new weapons and went out and committed a mass shooting. That unfortunately is very consistent with what we have seen in many of these situations. I mean, even look at Omar Mateen. Did he target the Pulse nightclub because it somehow fit into his newly formed ideological support for al-Baghdadi and ISIS? Or was it more that he targeted because he had underlying mental health issues and was dealing with sexual identity crisis issues? All may be true, but that's a reflection of the complexity of this environment and the challenge in this current threat environment, because there are times when a JTTF, as I mentioned before, someone may come to the attention of a JTTF. They have very specific thresholds that they have to apply in order to focus the resources of the JTTF on an individual. If a person does not meet that threshold, we have to have a complementary approach that will empower state and local officials or even federal officials to evaluate the risk and address the risk if it's high enough and it causes concerns for violence. And by the way, this isn't a new concept. This is what the Secret Service has been doing for decades as it relates to potential assassins, where they will evaluate if somebody should be subject to a criminal investigation because they have violated the law, or whether they should be subject to some type of threat management approach because they may not have violated the law, but they do represent a high risk of conducting a potential assassination type of incident to a protectee.
Great. Well, we have a lot of interest from our participating public, so let me jump straight into those questions, some of which I'm going to bundle together if they're similar. So we have several people who want to ask questions, which may or may not be directly best posed to DHS. I'll let you deal with that, on how to deal with the funding for extremism, whether it's coming from common sources, whether engagement with banks would be useful in this regard, and whether the domestic terrorism strategy addresses the issue of combating domestic violent extremist funding sufficiently.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So, there's a variety, when you look at it purely within the domestic environment, there's a variety of funding mechanisms. And in many cases, violent extremist activity does not require a lot of funding. I mean, particularly if it's an if it's an individual or a small group of individuals who come together and decide that they're going to carry out some type of violent incident, we have found that many of these activities do not require significant amounts of funding. They leverage easily acquirable weaponry, whether it's a car, a knife, a gun. They select targets that they're familiar with, typically. There may be some travel involved. So there's not a lot of money that's required. For the more high-level organizational activities, we're seeing a lot of crowdsourcing funding tools being used. But where this really gets interesting is the increasing level of collaboration occurring between individuals who hold violent extremist views here in the US and those in Europe and other parts of the world. We're now beginning to see and are becoming increasingly concerned, not just over the communication between those like-minded individuals and groups, but actually more operational collaboration. We have people, when events are being planned here, traveling here from Europe. We see more interactions via the dark web and the use of cryptocurrencies in order to share resources. So one of the areas that we're very focused on at the department, but working with Justice and Treasury and the intelligence community, is to understand those linkages. While this doesn't relate to the question, we want to understand, are there things that we can understand from a travel pattern analysis perspective that would be beneficial to us? And then relevant to the question is, are there ways that we need to adjust our sort of sensor network to pick up the movement of funding crypto, whether it's through cryptocurrencies or traditional sort of funding sources or funding methodologies, so that we can detect international collaboration.
Great. Tom Warwick asks, one thing missing from the domestic terrorism strategy was what he calls victory conditions. What are your views on what the goals or end state should be on the current domestic terrorism threat, and how will we know when we have, quote, won?
Yeah, leave it to Tom to ask a complicated question like that. I think we're going to see victory. You know, I was asked this question in a little bit of a different format, and I'm going to take some liberties and sort of restructure Tom's question a little bit, where I was asked, what would I like to see accomplished a year from now? If we were having this conversation a year from now, what would I like to see? And it would be three things, three areas. One, I'd like to see a more consistent capability in communities across the country to engage in threat assessment and threat management, which leads to a decrease in targeted attacks, incidents of targeted violence, and you start seeing reductions, whether it's in hate crimes or mass casualty attacks. That'd be the first thing. Second thing I'd like to see is a greater level of sophistication and understanding across our society regarding how false narratives, conspiracy theories, hate rhetoric are being spread online, and an increase in the educational opportunities, both for school-age kids, but as well as adults, so that there is more of an effort for people to look skeptically at hateful rhetoric and other disinformation that's being spread online for the purposes of influencing some type of malign behavior, or people just more interested in trying to find out whether something they're seeing is accurate or not. And third, I think, and this is both a sort of a causal factor, but also could be a metric, where we see a lowering in the temperature of the anger and polarization in our society. One of the things that adversaries, threat actors are leveraging, as I mentioned earlier, are the fractures in our society, the anger in our society, the polarization in our society. And it can be both a measure of success, or a measure of progress at least, and it can be an element of countering the threat to find a way to lower that temperature a little bit, to perhaps introduce into our political discourse that you don't have to paint those who disagree with you as your enemy or as enemies of the country in order to be effective politically. So those would be the three things that I'd like to see that would tell us that we're in the right path. I think the primary metric is we have seen a multi-year rise in targeted attacks by individuals who are inspired by these extremist ideologies. I think obviously a metric will be that we start seeing that trend reverse.
Thank you. John Shapiro asks how you view the risk from the extreme right as opposed to the extreme left. How does the department look at kind of those kind of threat baskets in that kind of political term?
Yeah, I mean, I stay away from saying which is worse. I mean, I think there's plenty of statistical analysis that's been done with regard to lethal attacks and lethal encounters, and I'll let those folks who did that research defend their work. We're ideologically neutral. If one is engaging in violent activity, regardless of the ideology, we have a responsibility to prevent the risk. Statistically, when looking specifically at lethal attacks and lethal encounters with law enforcement, there's a higher number of individuals who are inspired by white supremacist beliefs and anti-government beliefs that are engaged in those lethal attacks or those violent encounters with law enforcement. But at the end of the day, our responsibility is to prevent violence, regardless of the ideological belief behind it.
I recall correctly, though, from my own conversations with officials in the wake of the interagency intelligence report that was constructed at the request of the White House, under the anti-government and anti-authority violent extremism category, Antifa is expressly not included as an organization, correct?
Yeah, because Antifa isn't an organization, first of all. I mean, it is a belief system that includes people from a broad range of ideological beliefs that seek to counter what they view as fascist behavior, and whether it's fascist behavior caused by a group of white supremacists, or it's fascist behavior in their view by individuals who are associated with the government. What Antifa typically involves are people who believe they are fighting fascism. And in most of the incidents that involve people organizing under that belief system, we see destructive behavior. We may see people engaged in vandalism. We see people throwing perhaps water bottles and engaging in other activity during protests that are harmful or directly a threat to law enforcement. But they don't tend to be involved in lethal attacks. That's a big difference. But again, if they're vandalizing a federal building, or they're assaulting and throwing frozen water bottles at law enforcement, it's a problem, and we need to deal with it. But when we're focusing on lethal attacks, it's overwhelmingly those who are inspired by white supremacy and anti-government type extremist beliefs that are involved in those lethal incidents.
Alan Gilmer asks, a lot of extremist behavior leads to harassment and intimidation that is short of physical violence. How is that addressed in the strategy? And is the line for what you deal with drawn at physical violence? And if so, why?
It's not. I mean, and this raises a very interesting question, and it goes to one of the sort of the central themes in the strategy. And it's something we've talked about for years, Matt, which is to solve a problem, you have to understand a problem. Understanding how online narratives influence behavior, how that behavior can include behavior ranging from harassment, vandalism, a hate crime type incident, or even an act of targeted violence or mass casualty violence. Those are all ways that extremist ideological beliefs can manifest themselves. I think our challenge is that our analysis needs to reflect that. Our analysis needs to be very clear that you may have individuals who are, let's just say for the sake of discussion, white supremacists who may express their belief by marching down the street with a torch and limit it at that. You may have people who may seek to vandalize a mosque or a synagogue. You may have people who may spray paint swastikas on individuals' doors who they target because of their religion, or they may walk into a synagogue and gun people down while they're praying. So it's understanding what the belief system is. It's understanding the different ways it may be expressed, and then identifying those issues that are those activities that violate the law, and develop plans to mitigate that illegal behavior. I think, by extension, I think what happened on January 6th again is actually an interesting illustration of the complexity of the threat that we're facing. And this is directly relevant to the question. I mean, who was at the Capitol that day, right? We had people who came to Washington, D.C. to express their disappointment and views that the election was stolen, but they limited their activities to attending the event on the Olymps. Maybe they marched to the Capitol, maybe they were at the outside of the Capitol. You had individuals who came to Washington that day to express their disappointment with the results, but they came here with the intent as individuals to engage in destructive behavior and perhaps even violent behavior. And then thirdly, you had groups of individuals who came to the Capitol that day specifically for the purposes of engaging in destructive and violent behavior. They planned for the day, they prepared for the day, they equipped themselves for the day, they developed communication protocols, and when they got here, they acted in small unit formations based on their plan. Now, not in some cases, the people who were there didn't violate the law. And one could argue they were there expressing their constitutionally protected rights of free speech. In other cases, you had people who were there who did violate the law, but they were there as individuals, And then you had groups who came there and violated the law. What unified all these people? They were all brought to Washington by a disinformation narrative that the election had been stolen and that the president-elect was going to be inaugurated under fraudulent conditions. That was what brought them all there. So I think it's really a good illustration of the environment we're in right now, where part of it is the ideological belief, and then part of it has to do with distinguishing between the expression of that belief that's constitutionally protected and the expression of that belief through violent or destructive behavior, illegal behavior, that is should be the rightful focus of law enforcement.
Eva Hartran-Sanders asks, this year, the U.S. joined as a member of the Christchurch Call. Are there priority areas of research or positive interventions that the U.S. will be looking at? And how will this shape the Section 230 debate and what may replace it?
Boy, this is a very educated group. These are great questions. Yes, we did join the Christchurch Call. I think the Christchurch situation is actually a very good illustration of the dynamics of the current threat environment, where you have an individual who operated abroad, who conducted a mass casualty attack, who posted his attack online, who posted the ideological the beliefs that motivated the attack. We then saw individuals across the globe view the live stream, view the narrative, and then we ultimately had other attacks occur within the US by individuals who were influenced by that narrative and sought to promote the narrative through their own acts of violence. So that is a pretty good illustration of the dynamics of the threat and what we're trying to address. We have learned a lot also about how you can identify individuals through their online activity or through behavior they engage in within the community that should warrant, at the very least, threat assessment, evaluation, and perhaps a threat management strategy. And I think in many of these cases, when the people come to the attention of authorities, they may not have reached quite yet that level, that threshold of arrest or investigation, arrest, and prosecution, but they certainly are exhibiting signs that are consistent with what research from the Behavioral Analysis Unit and from the Secret Service NTAC, the National Threat Assessment Center, tell us should be of concern. So there are actually a number of examples where local communities have come together to engage in threat management activities that have most likely prevented attacks. So we've learned a lot about that as well, and that's woven into the strategy. As far as 230 and social media companies, I think there's a number of challenges as it relates to how these platforms are governed, regulated. I personally have some concerns about relying on a private sector company to be the arbiter of free speech. I have concerns about the commitment of a private sector company if you're asking them to do something that's diametrically opposed to their business model and their revenue generation model. At the same time, I'm highly impressed by the work that's going on in companies at Facebook and Twitter and Google and Jigsaw, where they are looking at building into their technological platforms, capabilities that measure toxicity and resonance of narratives so that they can, within their own platforms, can do things ranging from deplatforming people because they violate the user agreements or diverting content from high-risk individuals. That's stuff that's going to happen in their universe. I think what troubles me from a detection perspective is one of the things that we have seen is that narratives that have been particularly effective at resonating with, or particularly effective and have resonated highly with high-risk individuals, travel across multiple platforms. So part of our detection and threat mitigation efforts have to look at narratives that are spreading from Facebook to Twitter to YouTube to Gab to 4chan to Telegram, and the intra-organizational strategies that a lot of these companies are employing wouldn't necessarily address that. finally, while I'm confident companies like Twitter, Google, YouTube, or Twitter, Google, Facebook have the resources to take on these issues, there's a lot of smaller platform companies that just simply do not. And even if they had the good intention, they don't have the resources to do the type of work that's taking place in these companies. So it's a complicated issue, which is why we've ramped up significantly just since January 20th, our interaction with these companies. We want to learn from what they're doing. We want to develop partnership with them so that we can share with them what we're seeing, and develop a sort of holistic approach that deals with the online elements of this threat.
Excellent. You just addressed two other questions that we're asking about the social media space. So let's move on to Eric Roseanne, who asks, with all the justified focus on behaviors and behavioral science and growing emphasis on public health approaches, where is HHS on all of this?
They're at the table. You know, you may remember, Matt, that when I came and visited with you last time, I talked about the fact that after Boston Marathon, the White House National Security Council initiated an effort to look at, violent extremist activity. And after Newtown, which happened several months later, the Domestic Policy Council began an interagency effort to look at mass casualty attacks directed at schools and houses of worship. And ultimately, what we learned as both of those efforts sort of progressed is that many of a key part of the problem in both of those efforts, or both of those efforts we're seeking to address, were similar, and so were the solutions. So in the case of the domestic terrorism strategy, HHS was a big participant, as we are looking at developing, in particular, threat management strategies that involve greater access to inpatient and outpatient mental health care, as we are looking at educational opportunities, whether it's in middle school, high school, or in the university environment. HHS, among others, are at the table in those discussions. So
the department's not only dealing with domestic violent extremism, it continues to deal with terrorism inspired or directed by foreign terrorist organizations, and with people who are inspired by them, the HVE side of the equation. I understand the department was part of an interagency effort that recently produced an analysis of attacks since January of this year that were inspired, directed by foreign terrorist organizations, and found that while that threat persists, there were only 3 attacks that they were able to determine were inspired by Islamist foreign terrorist organizations in the current year in New York, in Texas, and in Florida. I just like this one question, for appropriate reasons, we're focusing on the domestic violence extremism issue today, but for you to give a moment's comment on the department's work on dealing with threats from foreign terrorist organizations at the same time.
Yeah, we're in a significant transition period. We are redeploying forces from Afghanistan, Iraq, other conflict zones. We are, the ISIS of 4 or 5 years ago is evolving. A number of the territories they controlled have been they've been displaced from those territories. Fighters that haven't been killed have spread across the region, joining regional organizations, perhaps gone back to their home countries in Eastern and Western Europe, or even other parts of the West. But one of the things that's really striking to me, particularly as it relates to the earlier part of our conversation, is the evolution that occurred from AQAP and Anwar al-Awlaki through ISIS in their use of online platforms to either recruit or incite attacks by individuals, and in Western countries, targeting the same populations we were discussing earlier that may be influenced by domestic violent extremist narratives, online narratives. When you look at some of the videos developed, and whether it's Flames of War or some of the other online content promoted by Islamic State in particular, it was specifically intended for young Westerners who were craving a sense of social connection and sense of life accomplishment. They sent a message: join our cause. You'll be a part of something, bigger than yourselves. You'll be a part of our family. And that resonated with people. And even though ISIS in the physical world is displaced, and we're going to see how that all sort of settles out as far as the physical threat environment, we can be assured of two things. One, it will reemerge. Those groups, the threat will reemerge, and we will continue to have to focus on either operatives seeking to enter the United States or attack, planes bound for the United States or U.S. interests abroad. And we have seen that their online activity has not stopped. And in fact, it was striking to me as we were tracking online content in and around the Derek Chauvin trial. We found that media elements associated with Al-Qaeda were specifically identifying protests regarding criminal justice reform in the US as opportunities for their followers to engage in acts of violence. We have continued to see online calls directed at an audience in the United States by online entities affiliated with the Islamic State calling for violence. In some respects, they're using a very similar playbook that was developed by the Soviet Union that's being used today in order to engage in these types of influence operations. So it was striking to me that while we're watching online messaging from Russia and Iran and violent extremists talking about the Derek Chauvin trial and the verdict using strikingly similar language, we also at the same time saw online media entities associated with Al-Qaeda pointing to these same sort of racial issues in the United States and promoting narratives intended to incite violence by people who connect with their ideology. So it's something we're very concerned about. We're continuing to monitor what's happening abroad. We are continuing to update, our targeting rules and our travel pattern analysis and our threat analysis capabilities so that we are able to detect threats by foreign terrorist groups against U.S. interests abroad in the U.S., particularly the aviation system. And we're also incorporating into our efforts to track online content efforts by foreign terrorist groups as well.
And so we'll sneak in one last question. We've been able to address almost every question that's come in. This is a technical one. Is the administration continuing with the National Security Threat Actor construct, which was identified by National Security Policy Memorandum 7? And if so, does this new DVE idea fit into that construct? And what work is required to look at the NSTA, the National Security Threat Actor, in terms of these threats holistically? How does DVE fit into that?
I think that's a conversation that's ongoing. As I mentioned before, and as I hope is clear from the way I sort of described it, the threat actors that are most prevalent in this part of the threat environment may not necessarily fit into the neat operational or definitional categories that we crave at the federal level or require at the federal level in order to incorporate those actors into pre-existing, structural and operational areas of focus. So, I think there's more research and analysis that's necessary to evaluate how best to incorporate those who represent the highest risk of attack under the current environment, how they fit into sort of these traditional structures.
John, I want to thank you and your staff for taking the time to participate today, for putting together such a thorough statement for the record, which we'll be posting to our website very shortly and making it public to everybody. I want to thank everybody who took the time to join us today, whether on the webinar itself or watching live stream, or for those of you who will be watching the live stream after the fact. This has been a tremendously insightful conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time and the work you're doing. I'm glad you came back into government, John. And thanks for all you do. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.